in the flickering torchlight of Lisbon's clifftop Palace of Belmonte, where candle smoke curls like ghosts and emeralds flash with cursed brilliance, a masked assembly gathers to toast a notorious marquis. Still shadowed by his wife's vanishing 30 years ago. But when midnight chandeliers plunge into darkness and a silk-wrapped dagger pierces the host's heart, scattering paste jewels and pinning a vellum scream, you murdered your wife beneath the orangery. Elderly sleuth Miss Jane Marple, with her quiet knitting and sharper gaze, steps into a labyrinth of forged secrets, embezzled fortunes and a single real emerald hidden in plain sight. As the Strathmore-like family, restless Heir Rodrigo, brittle Inez, drunken Duarte, meticulous Miss Sousa, unravels under debts, affairs, and a contested legacy, who among them turned candlelit revelry into a stage for murder? Join Miss Marple in this chilling Agatha Christie-style mystery, where every typed confession leads deeper into the palace's deadly past. Chapter 1. The Invitation. The postman in Danbury Hollow was a methodical man named Higgs, who believed that letters should arrive neither too early nor too late, but precisely at the moment when the recipient's kettle began to sing. On this particular Tuesday in late September, the kettle in Miss Marple's cottage had just reached its modest crescendo when Higgs tapped the brass knocker shaped like a dolphin. Jane Marple opened the door herself. She wore a dove-grey cardigan and the expression of someone who has been expecting precisely this interruption. Higgs handed over a single envelope and waited, as was his custom, for the small ceremony of acceptance. The envelope was heavier than any she had received in years. The paper was thick, almost velvety, with a faint watermark of a peacock whose tail feathers curled into the initials MMB. The flap was sealed with crimson wax, impressed by a signet she did not recognize, a crowned bird perched on a crescent moon. The postmark read Lisbon Central, the ink slightly smudged by transatlantic travel. "Thank you, Higgs," she said, and closed the door before he could embark upon the weather. Inside, the card was simple yet imperious. His Excellency the Marquis de Belmonte requests the pleasure of your company at the Palace of Belmonte, Lisbon, from the 23rd to the 30th of October, for a week of candlelit revels in celebration of his 60th year. Dress, mask. Discretion, absolute. A carriage will collect you from Southampton on the 20th. No signature beyond the embossed crest. No explanation of how the Marquise had obtained her address, or why, after 30 years of silence, he should remember the quiet Englishwoman who had once corrected his pronunciation of scone at a charity fete in aid of Belgian refugees. Jane placed the card upon the mantelpiece, beside the photograph of her nephew Raymond and the small porcelain spaniel that had belonged to her mother. She regarded it for a long moment, then took up her knitting. Grey wool, a lace pattern that demanded absolute concentration. She counted stitches aloud, softly, the way some people count rosary beads. One knew, of course, about the Marquise. One read the illustrated papers. There had been the marriage to the heiress from Pernambuco, the emeralds that outshone the chandeliers at Ascot, the winter night in 1924 when the Marchioness had driven away from the villa in Sintra and never returned. The Portuguese police had been polite, the English press less so. The Marquis had laughed in that careless way of his, called it a conjuring trick gone wrong, and sailed for Monte Carlo before the inquest. Jane finished her row, laid the needles across her knee, and considered the practicalities. She had no evening gown suitable for a mask, but Mrs. Bantry had once lent her a length of silver-grey silk that had never been made up. Her passport was still valid. Raymond had insisted, after that unfortunate business in the Caribbean, and the cottage cat, a disdainful tabby named Selwyn, could be entrusted to the Daily Woman. She wrote her acceptance on a sheet of Basildon bond, using the fountain pen her godmother had given her in 1919. The nib scratched pleasantly across the paper. "Dear Marquis de Belmonte, I accept with pleasure. Yours sincerely, Jane Marple." She underlined the word pleasure twice, blotted the page, and sealed it with plain wax. Higgs would collect it in the morning. That evening she dined frugally, poached egg, brown bread, a slice of seed cake, and afterwards sat by the fire with a volume of Trollope open on her lap, though she did not read. She was thinking about emeralds, and about the way certain men collect wives, the way other men collect stamps, for the pleasure of possession, and for the satisfaction of seeing them properly displayed. At 10 o'clock she banked the fire, locked the doors, and climbed the narrow stairs. In her bedroom she opened the wardrobe and took down the silver-grey silk. It shimmered like moonlight on water. She held it against herself in the looking-glass, and saw, not an elderly spinster, but a woman who had once danced the tango in Buenos Aires, and had never quite forgotten the steps. Somewhere in Lisbon, candles were already being counted, masks measured, secrets folded into vellum slips. Jane Marple closed the wardrobe door, turned the key, and went to bed. She did not sleep at once. She lay in the dark and listened to the small noises of the village settling for the night. The church clock striking 11, the rustle of leaves against the window pane, the distant bark of a dog. And beneath these familiar sounds, another. The faint rhythmic click of her knitting needles, though they lay downstairs on the table. Chapter 2. The Palace by Night. The liner from Southampton had been comfortable, the train from the docks to Lisbon less so, but the final ascent to the Palace of Belmonte was accomplished in a motor car whose springs had long ago surrendered to the cobbled switchbacks. Jane Marple sat very straight in the back seat, gloved hands folded over a small leather case that contained her knitting, her passport, and a single change of stockings. The chauffeur, a silent youth in dove-grey livery, negotiated the hairpin bends with the calm of one born to them. Below, the Tagus lay like a sheet of hammered pewter. Above, the palace lights blazed against a sky the colour of spilled ink. The gates were wrought iron, gilded, and wide enough for 2 carriages abreast. Torches in iron sconces lined the drive. Their flames streamed sideways in the wind off the river. Footmen in silver-braided coats stood at intervals, motionless as tin soldiers. The car swept beneath a portcullis that had not been raised since the Peninsular War, and halted before a flight of marble steps flanked by stone peacocks, whose eyes were chips of malachite. A major-domo, with the face of a disappointed archbishop, relieved Jane of her cloak and murmured that the Marquise awaited her in the Salon Dorado. He led her through corridors where tapestries of unicorn hunts moved in the draught and suits of armour kept their own counsel. The air smelled of beeswax, orange blossom, and something metallic. Old blood, perhaps, or merely the river. The Salon Dorado was not golden in the vulgar sense. Rather, the walls were hung with silk the colour of weak tea, and every candlestick, every frame, every inch of carving had been touched with gold leaf, until the room seemed to breathe light. 3 great chandeliers of rock crystal hung dark and unlit. In their place, hundreds of candles in wall sconces and on silver gueridons threw pools of trembling gold across the parquet. A string quartet, 2 violins, viola, cello, played scarlatti behind a screen of potted orange trees whose fruit glowed like small suns. The guests numbered perhaps 60. They moved in a slow, masked pavane, the women in gowns of silk and satin, the men in black tie or historical fancy. Masks were obligatory. Dominoes, half-masks, full visors of painted leather. Feathers, sequins, and bugle beads caught the candlelight and flung it back in splinters. Conversation was a low, continuous murmur, like bees in a hive. Jane had chosen simplicity. Her gown was the silver-grey silk, cut on austere lines, with long sleeves and a modest train. Her mask was black lace, tied with narrow ribbons. It concealed the upper half of her face and left her mouth free to smile, or to speak, as occasion demanded. She carried no fan, no reticule, only the small notebook and pencil stub tucked into her left glove. The Marquis de Belmonte stood upon a shallow dais beneath a portrait of himself at 25. Lean, arrogant, magnificent. He wore cloth of gold, the coat heavy with bullion embroidery, and a mask shaped like the sun, its rays tipped with tiny diamonds. When he saw Jane approaching, he descended the 2 steps with the lightness of a man half his age and bowed over her hand. "Miss Marple, you honour an old sinner." His English was flawless, the accent a mere breath of the Tagus. 30 years since the garden party for the Belgians. You wore a hat with cherries. I wore a hat with a single cherry, Jane corrected gently, and you wore a waistcoat that caused talk. He laughed, a sound like champagne uncorked. "Come, let me present my family before the unmasking at midnight. The game begins then." He offered his arm. Jane laid her fingers upon it and felt the muscle beneath the gold cloth, still firm. They moved through the throng. First the son, Rodrigo de Belmonte, 35, tall, with his father's hawk nose but eyes that shifted like quicksilver. His mask was plain black velvet. Behind it, his gaze was restless, as though he listened for footsteps behind him. He bowed with stiff correctness. "My son and heir," the Marquis said. "He manages the estates, or what remains of them." Rodrigo's mouth twisted. "Father flatters me. The estates manage themselves into ruin." Next, the daughter-in-law, Inés, once a Lisbon beauty, now thin as a reed and twice as brittle. Her gown was black lace over flesh-coloured silk, her mask a silver butterfly, whose wings trembled with every breath. She extended a hand heavy with rings and spoke in a voice like breaking glass. "Enchanted, señorita. My husband speaks often of English ladies. He says they are cold, but honest." Jane murmured something polite. Inés's fingers were cold indeed, and the rosary of black jet beads at her wrist clicked softly as she withdrew her hand. Then the cousin, Duarte de Belmonte, 40, plump, laughing, mask shaped like a fox with emerald eyes. He seized Jane's hand and kissed it with theatrical fervour. "Cousin Duarte keeps the cellars," the Marquis said, "and samples them. He will tell you the 08 port is drinking well." "Drinking superbly," Duarte affirmed. "Older than sin, and twice as tempting." He pressed a glass of champagne into Jane's hand. The bubbles rose like tiny balloons. Last, the secretary, Miss Ephigenia Souza, 28, severe in charcoal silk, spectacles glinting beneath a simple white domino. She carried a leather folder and looked as though she had never unbent in her life. She inclined her head. "Miss Sousa keeps me solvent," the Marquise said, "or tries to. She is proof that beauty and accountancy are not incompatible." Miss Sousa's lips thinned. "The Marquis is kind. I merely ensure that his generosity does not outrun his means." The Marquis clapped for silence. The quartet ceased mid-phrase. He mounted the dais again and raised his glass. "Friends, countrymen, fellow sinners, tonight we play a game. Each guest has received or will receive a secret. At midnight, the secrets are read aloud. The one who guesses the most truths wins my emerald parure." He gestured to a table where the jewels lay on black velvet, necklace, bracelets, tiara, each stone the size of a hazelnut and the colour of deep forest pools. A ripple of excitement passed through the room. Jane felt it like a breeze across water. She sipped her champagne and watched faces behind masks. Rodrigo's hand tightened on his glass. Inés's rosary clicked faster. Duarte laughed too loudly. Miss Sousa opened her folder and wrote something with a silver propelling pencil. Liveried footmen circulated with silver salvers. On each rested a folded slip of heavy vellum. Jane took hers from a tray offered by a boy whose wig was slightly askew. She unfolded it beneath the table's edge. "You once forged a bishop's signature to save a convent from ruin." The words were typed on an old machine. The E was faint and slightly raised. Jane refolded the paper and slipped it into her glove beside the notebook. Across the room, she saw Rodrigo's hand tremble as he read his own. Inés turned the colour of candle wax beneath her paint. The quartet struck up a waltz. Couples spun. Candles guttered in the draught from open windows. Jane excused herself, pleading the need for air, and slipped through a side door into a corridor lit only by a single sconce. The noise of the salon receded. She found herself in a small anteroom lined with portraits. Belmonte ancestors in ruffs, in armour, in periwigs. One frame was empty, the hook bare. She opened her notebook and wrote, "Secrets typed, same machine, emeralds, real, family tensions, debts." She closed the book as footsteps approached. A woman in a peacock mask hurried past, feathers brushing the wall. Behind her, Duarte's laughter echoed, too close. Jane returned to the salon. The Marquis was dancing with a girl in scarlet whose mask was a phoenix. Rodrigo stood alone by the orangery door, staring at the floor. Inés had vanished. Miss Sousa wrote steadily in her folder. At 11 o'clock the chandeliers were extinguished one by one. Only the candles remained, throwing long shadows that danced like devils. The game, Jane thought, had begun in earnest. She moved to the edge of the room and took up a position beside a marble pillar. From here she could see the dais, the jewel table, the doors. She noted the positions of the footmen, the height of the windows, the distance to the main staircase. Old habits, formed in village halls and vicarage drawing rooms, served her well in palaces. A clock somewhere struck the quarter. The Marquis raised his glass again. 1 hour to midnight. Let the secrets ferment. Jane felt the room tilt, the way it does before thunder. She finished her champagne and set the glass upon a passing tray. The stem was warm from her hand. In the orangery beyond the glass doors, orange trees rustled, though there was no wind. Somewhere, a candle sputtered and went out. Jane opened her notebook again and added a fourth line. Someone is afraid. She underlined the word twice, closed the book, and waited for the next move in the game. Chapter 3. The cast assembles. The waltz ended on a languorous chord. The dancers drifted apart like petals on a stream. Jane remained beside the marble pillar, half hidden by the frond of a potted palm. She'd learned long ago that the edge of any room is the best place from which to observe the centre. People forget the corners. They perform for the middle. A footman passed with a fresh tray of secrets. Jane declined with a small shake of the head. She had her own already, folded tight against her wrist. The boy moved on, silver sulphur glinting. Behind him, the Marquis descended from the dais and threaded his way through the crowd, sun mask catching candle flames like sparks. He stopped before a tall woman in a gown of midnight blue, whose mask was a crescent moon set with seed pearls. "Countess," he said, bowing, "you grace us." The Countess inclined her head. Her voice was low, amused. "I was told there would be emeralds, Belmonte. I see only candlelight." "Patience. Midnight reveals all." He moved on. Jane watched the Countess's gloved hand tighten on her fan. Ivory sticks, painted with tiny scenes of the hunt. The fan snapped shut with a click like a mousetrap. Rodrigo had reappeared. He stood near the jewel table, one hand in his pocket, the other holding a glass he had not tasted. His eyes, dark, impatient, swept the room and settled on his wife. Inez had returned. She hovered near the orangery door, rosary beads sliding through her fingers. She looked, Jane thought, like a woman counting sins instead of prayers. Duarte was easier to locate. Follow the laughter. He had gathered a small court near the string quartet. 3 young men in harlequin masks, and a girl whose domino was sewn with tiny mirrors. Duarte's fox mask was pushed up on his forehead. His cheeks were flushed with champagne and triumph. "And then the vintage was so exquisite," he was saying, "that the customs man wept. Actually wept. I gave him a bottle for his trouble." The harlequins laughed on cue. The mirror girl tilted her head, catching light like a disco ball. Jane noted the way Duarte's hand rested on the small of her back. Proprietary, familiar. The girl did not object. Miss Sousa had taken up a position beneath the portrait of the young Marquis. She wrote in her leather folder with the concentration of a clerk balancing ledgers. Every so often she glanced up, spectacles flashing, and made a tiny mark beside a name. Jane wondered what system she used. Debts, motives, or simply the order in which the secrets had been distributed. A new figure entered the salon from the terrace doors. Tall, stooped, dressed in the severe black of a 19th-century diplomat. His mask was a plain white oval, featureless. He moved with the deliberation of age or illness, leaning on an ebony cane. The Marquis intercepted him at once. "Dom Antonio, you honour us indeed." The old man's voice was a rustle of dry leaves. "I came for the emeralds, Belmonte, and for the truth." He did not wait for a reply, but continued toward the jewel table. Guests parted before him like curtains. When he reached the black velvet, he lifted the necklace with trembling fingers. The stones caught the candlelight and threw it back in cold green fire. "Paste," he said loudly. "Very good paste, but paste." A gasp rippled outward. The Marquis's sun mask tilted. For the first time his smile looked fixed. "Dom Antonio exaggerates," he said. "A trick of the light." The old man let the necklace fall. It landed with a soft clack. "We shall see at midnight." He turned and made his way to a chair near the fireplace. A footman brought him a glass of port. He did not drink. Jane added a fifth line to her notebook. Dom Antonio knew the Marchioness. The quartet began a stately pavan. Couples formed sets. Jane watched Inez refuse Rodrigo's hand with a gesture so sharp it might have cut glass. Rodrigo's jaw tightened. He bowed and walked away. Inez remained by the orangery door, rosary clicking faster than before. Duarte had abandoned his court and was now deep in conversation with the Countess beneath the moon mask. Their heads were close. Duarte's hand rested on her wrist. The Countess's fan lay forgotten on a nearby table. Miss Sousa closed her folder and approached the Marquis. She spoke softly, urgently. The Marquis listened, then shook his head. Miss Sousa's mouth set in a line Jane recognized. The look of a woman who has been overruled once too often. At 11:15 the chandeliers were relit briefly so that footmen could circulate with ices. Lemon, violet, rose. The cold sweetness cut through the heat of the candles. Jane accepted a spoonful of lemon and let it melt on her tongue while she watched Dom Antonio. The old man had not moved. His port remained untouched. His cane rested across his knees like a sword. A clock chimed the half-hour. The chandeliers dimmed again. The game was entering its final phase. Jane slipped from her pillar and made her way toward the orangery door. The air there was cooler, scented with orange blossom and damp earth. Through the glass she could see the trees in their tubs, fruit glowing like lanterns. Inez stood just inside, back to the room, rosary still moving. Jane paused in the doorway. "Madame de Belmont," she said softly, "the night air is sharp. You might take cold." Inez turned. Her butterfly mask had slipped. One wing hung askew. Her eyes were red-rimmed. "I'm quite well, thank you." Her voice shook. "My husband. He wishes to speak to his father alone, before midnight." Jane followed her gaze. Through the glass on the terrace beyond the orangery, Rodrigo stood with the Marquis. The older man's sun mask was pushed up now. His face in the moonlight looked suddenly old. Rodrigo gesticulated, hands slicing the air. The Marquis listened, head bowed. "They quarrel about money," Inez said. "Always money. The estates, the vines, the emeralds. My dowry is gone. Everything is gone." She pressed a hand to her mouth, as if to stop more words escaping. Jane offered her handkerchief, plain lawn, initialed in one corner. Inez took it, then returned it with a shaky laugh. "Forgive me, I am not myself tonight." Jane said nothing. She was watching Duarte. He had left the Countess and was now at the jewel table, lifting the tiara as Dom Antonio had done. He turned it in the candlelight, then set it down with care. His expression was unreadable behind the fox mask. Miss Sousa appeared at Jane's elbow. "Miss Marple, the Marquis asks that all guests return to the salon. The unmasking approaches." Her tone was brisk, but her hand trembled as she closed her folder. Jane noticed a smear of green ink on her cuff, the same shade as the wax on the invitation. In the salon, the atmosphere had thickened. Conversation was subdued, laughter forced. The quartet played a trembling air from Gluck. Jane resumed her place by the pillar. She opened her notebook and added, "Inez, afraid of her husband, Duarte, testing the jewels, Miss Sousa, ink on cuff." The clock struck 11:45. The Marquis raised his glass for the last time. 15 minutes, my friends. Let the candles burn low and the secrets rise." Jane closed her notebook. The room seemed to contract, as though the walls themselves leaned in to listen. Somewhere, a candle sputtered and died. The scent of hot wax mingled with orange blossom and fear. She looked once more at the cast assembled beneath the flickering light. The Marquis, sun mask gleaming, emeralds at his throat. Rodrigo, fists clenched, eyes on his father. Inez, rosary clicking like a clock running down. Duarte, fox mask tilted, smiling at nothing. Miss Sousa, folder clutched to her breast. Dom Antonio, white mask blank as bone. The Countess, moon mask cool, fan forgotten, and 60 others masked and waiting. Jane tucked the notebook into her glove. The game, she thought, was almost played. The next move would be murder. Chapter 4. The First Secret. The clock on the mantel, an elaborate affair of gilt bronze and Sèvres porcelain, had just chimed the first quarter after 11, when Jane felt the change in the room. It was not a sound, nor even a movement. It was the way the candle flames leaned all at once, as though a door had opened somewhere and let in a draught from the river. Conversations faltered mid-sentence. The quartet's final note hung in the air like a question. Jane slipped her hand into her glove and touched the folded vellum. The typed words pressed against her palm. You once forged a bishop's signature to save a convent from ruin. A harmless secret, 40 years old, known to no one now living except herself and the Mother Superior of St. Agnes, who had died in 1937. Yet someone had unearthed it, typed it on a machine with a faulty E, and slipped it beneath her plate at dinner. The game was more serious than the Marquise had pretended. Across the salon, Rodrigo had unfolded his own slip. He read it once, twice, then crushed the paper in his fist. His knuckles showed white. Inez, standing 3 paces away, watched him with the wariness of a deer scenting the hunter. Her rosary had ceased its clicking. The jet beads hung motionless. Duarte, ever buoyant, waved his vellum like a winning lottery ticket. Mine says I once sold a bishop's cope to a theatrical costumier. True, alas, the bishop was dead, the cope was moth-eaten, and the theatre paid in gold sovereigns. His laughter rang too loud. The harlequins joined in dutifully. Miss Sousa had not opened hers. She held the slip between thumb and forefinger as though it might explode. Her spectacles caught the candlelight and threw it back in 2 flat discs. Jane watched her slide the paper into her folder without reading it. Dom Antonio remained in his chair by the fire. A footman had removed the untouched port. In its place stood a glass of water. The old man lifted his slip with trembling fingers, held it close to the white mask, and let it fall. The paper fluttered to the parquet like a dead moth. The Marquis clapped once. Enough teasing! Let the secrets ferment until midnight. Dance, drink, speculate. At the stroke of 12, we unmask and reveal. He signalled the quartet. They struck up a lively gallop. Couples whirled, skirts belled, coat-tails flew. Jane retreated behind the palm again and opened her notebook. Secrets distributed at 10:47 precisely, footman's watch. Rodrigo's reaction, anger or fear, Miss Sousa did not read hers. She was adding a 12th line when a hand touched her elbow. The Countess in the moon mask stood beside her, fan now restored to her fingers. Miss Marple, is it not? The Marquise pointed you out. You are the English lady who sees everything. Jane inclined her head. I see only what is there to be seen, Countess. Then tell me, what do you see now? Jane considered. I see a room full of people pretending to enjoy themselves. I see candle smoke and nerves. I see the Marquis watching his son as though Rodrigo were a chess piece about to be sacrificed. The Countess's fan paused. And the emeralds? Paste, Jane said simply. Dom Antonio is right. The setting is modern, the claws too bright. Real emeralds would have scratched the velvet by now. The fan snapped shut. "You interest me. Walk with me." They moved along the edge of the dancers. The Countess's perfume was heavy, jasmine and something darker, like church incense. She spoke without looking at Jane. "My husband was the Marquise's banker. He died last year. Heart, they said. But he had been receiving letters, anonymous, typed, threats, about the Marchioness, about emeralds that were never declared to the estate." Jane said nothing. They had reached the jewel table. The tiara lay slightly askew. One stone had worked loose and rolled to the edge of the velvet. The Countess picked it up between gloved fingers. "Glass," she said, "but very good glass. The Marquis always did have an eye for illusion." She let the stone fall. It bounced once and lay still. "Midnight will be interesting," she said, and melted back into the crowd. Jane remained by the table. She lifted the necklace, weighed it, set it down. Then, with the delicacy of a surgeon, she turned over the black velvet. Beneath, taped to the underside, was another slip of vellum. She peeled it free. "You will die before the unmasking. The same typewriter, the same faulty E." Jane folded the paper and tucked it into her glove with the first. She looked up. The Marquis was watching her from the dais, sun mask tilted. He raised his glass in salute. At 11:30, Jane excused herself and found the small library she had noticed earlier. The door was ajar. A single candle burned on the desk. The room smelled of leather bindings and cedar. She closed the door softly and crossed to the desk. An open ledger lay there. Columns of figures marched down the pages, dates, amounts, initials. RB, IB, DB, ES. The last entry was dated 3 days ago. 50,000 escudos to ES, final. A red line had been drawn beneath it. Beside the ledger, a photograph in a silver frame, the Marchioness at 25, laughing, emeralds at her throat. The glass was cracked diagonally, as though someone had struck it. Jane heard footsteps in the corridor. She slipped behind the heavy velvet curtain that screened the window. The door opened. Rodrigo entered, mask pushed up on his forehead. He went straight to the desk, opened the top drawer, and took out a small velvet box. Inside, a single emerald, unset, the size of a pigeon's egg. He weighed it in his palm, then returned it to the drawer and locked it. The key he slipped into his waistcoat pocket. He stood for a moment, staring at the photograph. Then he struck the frame with his fist. The cracked glass shattered completely, shards tinkled to the floor. Rodrigo swore under his breath and left, closing the door with exaggerated care. Jane waited until his footsteps faded. She emerged, brushed glass from the ledger, and noted, "Emerald in drawer, real, ledger, ES paid off, photograph deliberately broken." She was copying the last ledger entry when the candle guttered. Wax spilled across the page, obliterating the final figure. Jane blotted it with her handkerchief, but the damage was done. She returned to the salon. The gallop had ended. A slow, melancholy saraband had begun. Couples moved like sleepwalkers. The candles were burning low. Pools of wax trembled on the silver sticks. Jane resumed her place by the pillar. She saw Rodrigo returning from the library corridor, face flushed, key glinting at his waistcoat. Inez watching him, rosary now wound tight around her wrist. Duarte at the buffet, filling a plate with oysters as though famine loomed. Miss Sousa by the orangery door, folder open, writing furiously. Dom Antonio still in his chair, water untouched, White Mask turned toward the jewel table. The Countess dancing with the Marquis, Moon Mask close to Sun Mask. A footman extinguishing candles one by one, working his way toward the dais. Jane opened her notebook and wrote, "Candles being reduced. Why?" The clock struck 11:45. The Marquis raised his glass. 15 minutes, my friends. Let the secrets rise like champagne." Jane closed her notebook. The room was darker now. Shadows pooled in the corners. She felt the weight of the 2 vellum slips in her glove, the coolness of the pencil stub. Somewhere in the palace, a door closed with a soft final click. She looked at the jewel table. The tiara had been righted, the loose stone replaced. But the black velvet showed a faint crease where she had lifted it. Someone else had noticed. The sarabanda ended. Silence fell, broken only by the hiss of wax. Jane waited. The next secret would not be on paper. Chapter 5. The Second Death. The clock on the mantel had only to strike once more, at 11:45, when the lights failed. Not all at once. First the great chandeliers of rock crystal dimmed as though a hand had turned an invisible wheel. Then, with a soft pop, every electric bulb in the sconces along the walls expired. The candles remained, but the sudden plunge from brilliance to guttering gold was absolute in the centre of the room. A woman screamed. Glass shattered somewhere near the buffet. The quartet's bow scraped a single discordant note and stopped. Jane stood motionless beside the marble pillar. She had expected something of the sort. The footman had been extinguishing candles with methodical care. Still, the darkness pressed like wet velvet. She counted heartbeats, 1, 2, 3, until tapers appeared in the hands of the liveried boys. And the chandeliers were coaxed back to life, one by one, until the salon blazed again. The Marquis lay sprawled at the foot of the dais, cloth of gold coat rucked up beneath him, sun mask turned backward so that the rays pointed at his spine. A dagger protruded from his heart. The blade was antique, part of a display of arms on the wall behind the dais. Toledo steel, hilt once wrapped in gilded wire, now bound with black silk. Blood had already soaked the bullion embroidery and was spreading in a dark lake across the parquet. The emerald parure lay scattered like green hail. Necklace broken, stones rolling in slow circles, bracelets unclasped, tiara on its side, one prong bent. A single candle on the dais had been extinguished by the fall. Its wax had splattered across a slip of vellum pinned beneath the Marquis's outflung hand. The typing was still legible. "You murdered your wife for the emeralds and buried her beneath the orangery." Rodrigo knelt beside his father, mask gone, face the colour of tallow. His hands hovered above the dagger, as though afraid to touch it. Ines had fainted. Her butterfly mask lay crushed beneath her cheek, silver wings crumpled. Duarte fanned her with his fox mask, mouth working soundlessly. Miss Sousa stood apart near the jewel table, leather folder open, writing with a pencil that scratched like an insect. Dom Antonio had not moved from his chair. The white mask was turned toward the body. But whether in sorrow or satisfaction, it was impossible to tell. Jane noted 3 things at once. The dagger's hilt was wrapped in black silk torn from a woman's petticoat, freshly cut, the edges still sharp. The Marquis's own sun mask had been reversed deliberately. The elastic band was twisted. The spilled wax had preserved the vellum slip perfectly, as though someone had planned the splash. She stepped forward. The parquet was slippery. She steadied herself against the dais. The Marquis's eyes were open. fixed on the chandelier above. His right hand still clutched a crumpled secret, his own, perhaps, or another's. A footman shouted for the doors to be locked. Guests milled, some weeping, some rigid with shock. The quartet had vanished behind their screen of orange trees. Jane heard the Countess's voice, cool and precise. "Someone open a window. The air is foul." Jane knelt, careful of her gown, and touched the Marquise's wrist. Cold already, though the blood was warm. She lifted the crumpled paper from his fingers. It was blank except for a single line in the same typewriter. "Your son will hang for this." She folded it and slipped it into her glove with the others. Rodrigo found his voice. "Father!" It cracked like a boy's. He looked up at the circle of masked faces. Who did this? No one answered. Inez stirred, moaned, and was sick into a potted palm. Duarte dropped his fox mask and stared at his hands as though they belonged to a stranger. Miss Sousa closed her folder with a snap. "The police," she said. "Someone must telephone the police." A footman ran. Jane rose and surveyed the room. The dagger had come from the wall display. The empty space gaped like a missing tooth. The black silk binding the hilt was torn in a straight line. She could see the scissors mark. Someone had prepared the weapon in advance. She moved to the jewel table. The scattered emeralds were indeed paste. One had cracked in the fall, revealing a core of green glass. But beneath the table, half hidden by the velvet's overhang, lay a small key. Brass, old, with a tag Biblioteca, the library key. Rodrigo's waistcoat pocket was empty. The key he had taken earlier was gone. Jane palmed the brass key and returned to the dais. The spilled wax on the vellum slip had hardened into a translucent seal. She lifted the paper carefully. Beneath it, pressed into the soft wood of the dais, was the faint outline of a shoe. Small, narrow, a woman's dancing slipper with a louis heel. The chandeliers flickered again, then steadied. Footsteps echoed in the corridor, hurried, official. 2 men in plain dark suits entered, followed by a sergeant in uniform. The older inspector had a moustache like a well-kept hedge. The younger carried a notebook and looked as though he had been dragged from his bed. "Polizia Judiciaria," the older man announced. "No one leaves this room." He knelt by the body, touched the dagger, and swore softly in Portuguese. The younger inspector began to take names. Guests removed masks with reluctant fingers. Faces emerged pale, sweating, defiant. Jane approached the older inspector. "Miss Jane Marple, guest. May I suggest the weapon was prepared earlier? The silk binding is fresh, and the lights were tampered with. Look at the chandelier chains." The inspector followed her gaze. One chain had been filed almost through. A thread of metal glinted. He nodded grimly. Rodrigo stood. "My father was alive at 11:45. I saw him raise his glass." Inez, supported by Duarte, whispered, "He was arguing with someone. Behind the screen, I heard voices." Miss Sousa said nothing. Her pencil had snapped. The point lay on the floor like a tiny dagger. Dom Antonio rose slowly. "The emeralds are false," he said. "The motive is false. Find the real crime." The inspector silenced him with a look. He turned to Jane. "You, senorita, you see much?" "I see what is there," Jane replied. "And what is not. The key to the library is missing from the son's pocket. The dagger was wrapped by a woman. The lights failed at the precise moment the dais candle was extinguished. Someone knew the sequence." The inspector's moustache twitched. You will remain available." Jane inclined her head. She moved to the orangery door and looked out. The terrace was empty. The orange trees rustled, though the night was still. On the balustrade lay a single jet bead, Inez's rosary, broken in the struggle perhaps. She added to her mental list, library key under table, Rodrigo's, woman's shoe print on dais, jet bead on terrace, Inez. The sergeant began to herd guests into the east wing. Jane lingered. She watched Miss Sousa retrieve her broken pencil, wrap it in a handkerchief, and slip it into her folder. She watched Duarte help Inez to a chair, his hand lingering on her shoulder. She watched Rodrigo stare at the dagger as though it might speak. The inspector covered the marquee with a tapestry taken from the wall, a hunting scene, ironically. The candle stubs were gathered, the wax scraped from the vellum slip. The false emeralds were swept into a leather pouch. Jane slipped into the library corridor. The door was unlocked. The candle on the desk had burned low. The ledger was closed, the photograph of the Marchioness gone. In its place, a single emerald, the real one, lay on the blotter, catching the flame like a drop of poison. She heard footsteps behind her. Miss Sousa entered, folder clutched to her chest. "You should not be here," she said. "Nor should you," Jane replied, "but the emerald is." Miss Sousa's eyes flicked to the stone. "It is evidence." "It is bait," Jane said, "and you are caught." Miss Sousa turned to flee. Jane stepped aside. The inspector stood in the doorway, moustache bristling. The second death, Jane thought, was not the Marquise. It was the illusion that anyone in this house was safe. Chapter 6. The Unmasking. The police sealed the palace at dawn. A grey drizzle had begun to fall, turning the torches along the drive into hissing plumes of smoke. The guests, now unmasked, pale and shivering in borrowed dressing gowns, were confined to the east wing under the eye of two sergeants who looked as though they had not slept since the Peninsular War. Jane was given the late Marchioness's boudoir. Pale green walls, chintz curtains faded to the colour of weak tea, a crucifix above the bed that watched her with carved wooden sorrow. She requested tea, Earl Grey, no milk, one lump, and a quiet room in which to think. The tea arrived in a Sèvres pot. The quiet was less easily obtained. Through the wall she could hear Inez sobbing, a thin, hopeless sound like a kettle left too long on the hob. Down the corridor, Rodrigo paced. She counted the steps, 12 one way, 12 back, pause, 12 again. Somewhere a clock struck 6, then 7, then 8. Jane sat at the marquetry dressing table and arranged her clues like a hand of patience. The forged bishop's secret, her own harmless 40 years old. The death threat found beneath the velvet. You will die before the unmasking. The accusation pinned by the dagger. You murdered your wife. The blank vellum in the Marquise's hand. Your son will hang for this. The real emerald left on the library blotter. The brass library key found beneath the jewel table. The black silk on the dagger hilt. Torn from a petticoat, scissors still warm. The woman's shoe print in the wax. The broken rosary bead on the terrace. The filed chandelier chain. The ledger entry, 50,000 escudos to ES. Final. Miss Sousa's refusal to read her secret. The snapped pencil, wrapped in a handkerchief. She laid the vellum slips in a row, then the brass key, then the jet bead. The emerald she left in its velvet box, evidence, but also temptation. She opened her notebook and wrote in her neat slanting hand, motive, not the paste jewels, but the real emerald and the ledger. Opportunity, the lights failed at 11:47 precisely. Chain filed, candles reduced. Method, Dagger prepared in advance, silk binding cut in the Marchioness's sewing room, scissors found in Miss Sousa's folder. She underlined the last line twice. At noon, the inspectors summoned them to the winter garden. Orange trees in tubs gave off a damp, sweet scent. Rain drummed on the glass roof. The guests sat on gilt chairs that looked too fragile for human weight. Dom Antonio had been given a throne-like seat near the fountain. He leaned on his ebony cane and stared at the koi as though they might confess. Inspector Mendes, the moustache, stood beneath a pergola of withered wisteria. His younger colleague, Sergeant Braga, held the leather pouch of paste emeralds and the real stone in its box. "We will take statements," Mendes announced, "one at a time, beginning with the family." Rodrigo spoke first. He had removed his waistcoat. The empty key pocket gaped like a wound. "My father was alive at 11:45. I saw him toast the room. Then I went to the library to fetch. He hesitated a document he required. I was there perhaps 5 minutes. When I returned, the lights failed. I heard the scream." Mendes raised an eyebrow. "The library key was found beneath the jewel table." Rodrigo flushed. "It must have fallen from my pocket in the confusion." Ines was next. She had wrapped herself in a man's dressing gown 3 sizes too large. The sleeves swallowed her hands. I was by the orangery door. My husband and I had quarrelled. He wished to speak to his father alone. I heard raised voices behind the orange trees, then nothing. When the lights went out, I fainted. I remember nothing more. Duarte cleared his throat. "I was at the buffet. Oysters, excellent oysters. I saw nothing until the scream." Mendes turned to Miss Sousa. She stood very straight, spectacles polished, folder clutched like a shield, and I was taking notes on the distribution of the secrets. At 11:46, I noticed the chandelier chain had been tampered with. I intended to warn the Marquis, but the lights failed. Jane asked mildly, "And your own secret, Miss Sousa? You did not open it." Miss Sousa's lips thinned. "I had no need. I typed them all." A gasp rippled through the winter garden. Mendes's moustache bristled. "You admit to composing the secrets." "I typed them at the Marquis's dictation. He wished to," she searched for the word, "enliven the evening." The death threat beneath the velvet was not among them. Jane produced the vellum slip. "This one?" Miss Sousa took it, adjusted her spectacles. "No, the typewriter is the same, the e-sticks, but the phrasing is not his." Mendes took the paper. "Then who added it?" Jane said, "The same person who filed the chandelier chain, wrapped the dagger, and left the real emerald in the library as bait. The same person who embezzled from the estate for years to cover the Marquis's losses and feared exposure when the ledger was demanded." She turned to Miss Sousa. "You loosened the chains at 11:30 when you pretended to adjust the orangery door. You cut the silk in the sewing room at 11:40. The scissors were still warm when I passed the door. You extinguished the dais candle yourself at 11:47, knowing the falling wax would preserve your forged accusation. You hoped the darkness would mask your strike." Miss Sousa's spectacles flashed. "Absurd! I was taking notes." Jane opened the leather folder, removed the broken pencil wrapped in handkerchief. "Graphite on your cuff matches the ledger entries, and this," she produced the snapped pencil, "broke when you wrote the final accusation in haste. You wrapped it to hide the fresh break." Sergeant Braga opened the folder. Inside, the scissors, a spool of black silk, a spare chandelier chain link, and a carbon copy of the death threat. Mendez snapped handcuffs. Miss Sousa did not struggle. Her voice was flat. He was selling everything. The emerald was all that remained. He promised me a share if I kept the books clean. Then he changed his mind. Rodrigo stared at her. You killed him for money. For survival, she said. He would have ruined us all. Dom Antonio spoke for the first time, and the Marchioness. Miss Sousa's shoulders sagged. She found the ledger years ago. She threatened to expose him. He said she left for Brazil. Perhaps she did, in a manner of speaking. Silence fell, broken only by the rain on the glass roof. The koi swam in slow circles, mouths opening and closing like secrets. Mendez dismissed the guests. Jane lingered. The real crime, she said, was not the murder. It was the slow bleeding of a family over 20 years. The emeralds were only the symptom. Mendez nodded. We will dig beneath the orangery. Jane returned to the boudoir. She packed her small case, folded the silver-grey silk, and pinned her brooch, a tiny enamel cat, to her travelling coat. In the looking-glass, she saw an elderly lady with bright eyes, and a mouth that had learned not to smile too soon. At the door, she met Rodrigo. He carried the velvet box. Miss Marple, the emerald. My father kept it hidden. A souvenir, he said, of happier lives. He placed the box in her hands. For your trouble. Jane opened it. The stone blazed like a green star. Keep it, she said. Sell it. Pay the debts. Begin again. He hesitated, then nodded. Tears stood in his eyes but did not fall. Outside, the drizzle had stopped. The Tagus glittered under a pale sun. Jane walked down the cliff path to the waiting car. In her pocket, the black silk scrap, the wax-stained vellum, the jet bead. Evidence, but also reminders. She looked back once. The palace windows were dark now, the torches extinguished. Somewhere beneath the orangery, the police would find what remained of a woman who had loved too well and trusted too little. Jane settled into the motor car. The chauffeur closed the door. As they descended the switchbacks, she opened her notebook to a fresh page and wrote, Case closed. Motive, greed masked as loyalty. Lesson, secrets like candles burn brightest just before they go out. She closed the book, tucked it into her glove, and watched the palace shrink in the mirror until it was no larger than a child's toy. Then she turned her face to the road ahead, and to whatever small village, with its own small murders, waited beyond the horizon. Chapter 7. The Last Candle. The palace was quiet at last. The police had gone, taking Miss Sousa in a Black Maria that vanished down the cliff road like a beetle. The guests had departed in a straggle of motor cars and taxis, masks discarded in the gravel, faces grey with exhaustion. The drizzle had returned, soft and persistent, washing candle smoke from the air and blood from the parquet. Only the orange trees in the winter garden remained, their fruit glowing like small, patient moons. Jane lingered in the library. The portrait of the young Marquise had been removed. In its place hung a rectangle of darker wallpaper, the outline of a frame still visible. The ledger was gone, the photograph of the Marchioness too. The real emerald had been returned to Rodrigo, who stood now at the window, velvet box open in his palm. The stone caught the last of the daylight and threw it back in cold green fire. "You are certain you will not keep it?" he asked. Jane shook her head. "It belongs to the living. Sell it discreetly. Pay the debts. Plant new vines. The past is a poor investment." He closed the box. "And my mother?" "They will find her beneath the orangery. Give her a proper grave. Some secrets should be buried with dignity." Rodrigo's mouth twisted. Miss Sousa said many things, most of them lies to save her skin. Your father was cruel, but he was not a murderer. He loved your mother in his fashion. He kept her portrait cracked but unbroken for 20 years. That is a kind of fidelity. Rodrigo looked at the empty wall. I hated him. Hate is a luxury, Jane said. You cannot afford it now. He slipped the box into his pocket. Will you stay for the funeral? I have a train to catch, and a cat in Danbury Hollow who disapproves of tardiness. She picked up her small case. In the corridor, Inez waited, wrapped in a travelling cloak the colour of storm clouds. Her butterfly mask was gone. Her face was bare, the paint washed away by tears or rain. I am leaving him, she said simply. My family in Porto will take me. The rosary was my mother's. I broke it when I pushed Miss Sousa away from the dagger. I thought she was aiming for Rodrigo. Jane patted her hand. You did what you could. Go home. Pray for the living. Duarte appeared at the foot of the stairs, hat in hand, fox mask dangling from his fingers like a dead animal. Cousin Jane, he said, attempting his old laugh. It came out hollow. I find I am not cut out for tragedy. I shall return to the cellars. Port is kinder than people. Jane smiled. Sample it sparingly, and pay your debts before they pay you. Dom Antonio was the last. He stood in the entrance hall, cane tapping the marble. The white mask lay on a side table. His face was a map of wrinkles and old sorrows. You were right, he said. The emeralds were paste, but the Marchioness was real. I loved her once. She laughed at my poems. Jane took his hand. It was dry as parchment. Write her one now. The best poems are epitaphs. He nodded. A footman helped him into a waiting car. The ebony cane glinted as the door closed. Jane walked down the steps. The chauffeur held an umbrella. The rain had softened to mist. She paused at the bottom and looked back. Rodrigo stood on the terrace, Inez beside him, though not touching. Duarte raised a hand in farewell. The palace loomed behind them, windows blind, torches out. She climbed into the motor car. As they descended the switchbacks, she opened her notebook to the final page. Lessons from Lisbon. Candlelight flatters no one for long. Secrets typed on old machines leave traces. Emeralds, real or false, are only stones. Families are held together by debts, not blood. Murder is the last resort of the unimaginative. She closed the book and slipped it into her glove beside the scrap of black silk, the wax-stained vellum, and the single jet bead. The car reached the gates. The stone peacocks watched with malachite eyes. At the station, she bought a ticket to Southampton via Paris. The platform smelled of coal smoke and wet wool. She found her compartment, arranged her case on the rack, and took out her knitting. Grey wool, a new pattern, something simple after the complexities of lace. The train pulled out. Lisbon receded, the palace on its cliff, the Tagus glittering, the orange trees glowing in the winter garden. Jane counted stitches aloud, softly. 1, 2, 3. At Calais, she changed for the boat train. The sea was calm, the gulls white against a pearl sky. She posted a postcard to Mrs. Bantry. Weather fine. Intriguing company. Home soon. J.M. In London, she took the local to Danbury Hollow. Higgs met her at the station with the pony cart. Selwyn the cat inspected her shoes, sniffed, and approved. That evening she dined frugally. Poached egg, brown bread, seed cake, and sat by the fire with Trollope open on her lap. She did not read. She was thinking about emeralds, and about the way certain men collect wives the way other men collect stamps. She was thinking about candlelight, and how it burns brightest just before it goes out. At 10 o'clock she banked the fire, locked the doors, and climbed the stairs. In her bedroom she opened the wardrobe and hung the silver-grey silk. It shimmered like moonlight on water. She held it against herself in the looking-glass, and saw, not an elderly spinster, but a woman who had once danced the tango in Buenos Aires, and had never quite forgotten the steps. She closed the wardrobe, turned the key, and went to bed. Outside, the village settled for the night. The church clock striking 11, the rustle of leaves against the window-pane, the distant bark of a dog. And beneath these familiar sounds, another, the faint rhythmic click of her knitting needles, though they lay downstairs on the table.